welcome to Introblog's Open Source episode 35. And we're continuing this bold new era of trying new different pieces of content. And in the last one, we talked about, how the future of work could look like, and kind of lends very nicely into this new episode, which is about change, and specifically change management. And or just change in general, I think, because I think there were some discussions regarding the word management itself. But I'm going to hand it over to Rory Unsworth to kick off this session.
Thanks, Walid. So I guess the reason I'm going first is that in the pairing with Mark, somehow I represent the traditional view of change management. My experience came the hard way. So trying to bring change relating to my area of work in a large company and finding it incredibly difficult. And just to be clear, the changes I was trying to bring were always around the use of AI and process automation to view legal contracts as data. That's the biography piece, right? But anyway, in the change management context, I tried various approaches, including guerrilla style, where you bring the change, you show people how magnificent it is for them and their daily lives, you hope and pray for adoption. None of it ever had the impact I wanted to, and it felt like it relied much too much on my own personal brand rather than on anything else. And obviously personal brand is a finite resource. And in a big organization without the right sponsorship, your own personal brand, it's quite a thin raincoat in a blizzard. But that's not what's going to keep you comfortable. And the problem is, for people like me, we're constant optimizers. We just can't help it, right? It's just how we are. So I think this is me, Walid and Mark in a nutshell. Better, and it's probably an unhealthy addiction to change. So anyway, after years of trying all this stuff, I realized, hang on, change management is a thing. There are courses in it, and let's have a look at what other people have learned. And the course I took lasted about a week, and it was by one of the largest change management training organizations who have their own copyrighted method, so very professional. And the first page of the book that I read, I opened it up, and it said, the natural reaction to change is resistance, which really, for me, was a eureka moment. It felt like all my past mistakes were explained away by the simple fact that I'd experienced this, but I'd never quite formulated it. So that the scales really fell away from my eyes. And the rest of the course was all about how you manage that resistance to change to make adoption more effective. So I also learned during that course that the instructor, and this is a bit the anecdote, had helped South Africa manage its post-apartheid changes. And obviously that's a really cool gig. But then it got me thinking, okay, so their method doesn't always work brilliantly, right? Anyway, maybe some changes are harder than others. Maybe that's what explains that one. But anyway, my instinct tells me that these specialists are not wrong about resistance to change. And a lot of people in organizations, they spend a long time learning their jobs and refining their personal process by which they carry out their job and getting paid for that and building the rest of their lives around that security. And then, in comes the change person, and they tell them their job needs to be done differently. And maybe they're not the first to try this, to take on this task of changing this particular process. Maybe some of the predecessors got it wrong. So the employee naturally thinks, well, what would you know? You haven't done my job. You haven't learned everything I've learned, and you don't know that, I myself have adapted it and I'm doing it as well as it can be done, as well as it needs to be done. And you think also, I guess this is the kind of the reverse of the coin. You think, what does this add to the value of the knowledge I acquired in applying this process, this approach, my own personal strategy? Do I need to learn new stuff? How does it affect me? Can I learn new stuff? Am I capable of learning new stuff? And one of my favorite anecdotes around change is the Union of Musicians in the US. So in the 1920s, you had this crossover in terms of the way sound was delivered to cinemas. So it used to be orchestras, and it was moving to the gramophone record, aka the record player. So these guys, the National Union of Musicians, took out a full-page spread in all the newspapers and said, this is a terrible thing. Record players are the devil, and this will never work. And I guess that's a normal reaction to me. You defend your space, you resist. It's a barrel of crabs. So the changes I brought to my company after my course felt somehow easier because I had a method. So in a not very thought through way, I concluded, okay, this kind of works. I believe it, particularly as it also somehow helped to protect me and help me navigate through stress and frankly, periods of lows, right? You get lows when you try and change things in large companies. Now, look at me, look at my background, look at Mark, and look at his background. I think this guy has broader experience in change and change management than I do, with his bulletproof vest and his panoply of illustrations there. So, Mark, you've done a broader variety of consulting missions than I have, and I keep hearing from you between the lines on this show that change is not hard, actually, that there's no resistance from people, and that the orthodoxy I've got is wrong. And we've never really had this debate between ourselves. So I'd love you to express your take on this based on your experience, and I'm sure I have a hell of a lot to learn here.
Well, thank you. And there are a lot of things I have shared experiences of, Rory, in terms of things that you've been through and experiences that you've had and different tactics. So I would say that, and in using methods, and I guess to kind of shape it. And firstly, my assertion is that people are not change resistant. And the examples I give are, we change job, we move house, we get married, we have children. They're big changes. However, it doesn't mean that we won't resist change. And what I'd say is, from a change management point of view, people have, to kind of look at the picture, people have been seeking silver bullets for a long time. So I've been fascinated by the search of change managers, and I'll come back to change managers in a moment, for a silver bullet. And I've created a taxonomy of change models. I'm actually due an update. I've got 48 models in this version, and I'll share a link to it, change related models. I'm up to 56 in the new version. And if people see any change models that I'm not included, and I know there'll be tons, let me know, and we can always add them in. But it's back to, and the example that you gave in your experiences, lots of these change models, I looked at them, take a kind of an engineering approach to it. And what I mean by that is it's heavily on process. And in a nutshell, you let people know what the change is about, and you articulate it to them. And they may not get that. So when you're an experienced change manager, you will repeat it. And you repeat it a few times. It's like talking to your children. Sometimes you've got to, say it again, and maybe a little bit louder, and slightly change your position and use different words. And then that may not work, because whilst what you're broadcasting makes perfect sense to you, it doesn't land with the other person. And we can be back to this multiple intelligences again. I mean, firstly, cognitively, you might not trust it, you might not believe it. Emotionally, it might conflict with your values. It might conflict with your relationship effect. It might conflict with your beliefs. Prime example, if 18 months ago we'd been talking about now is really the time to have people at home working, many leaders have said, no, that's just not possible. You need people, you can't trust them, you've got to be able to see them. So strong beliefs. And then things may not land at an identity level. So this isn't who I am. For example, I am a legal expert in an insurance business, and that's what you do. You provide legal expertise. It doesn't define you as a person, but we conflate what we do with who we are. So anything that challenges our identity is difficult. Then it might challenge our safety. So look what happened when this change was made in this team. Half of them were let go. Why would I want to embrace this? Or it's about mobility. So do I want to move or not? So the problem is that the change manager can go through this dance and it's still not landing, because they're just seeing the surface structure, which might be people asking questions. It might be people resisting. So at this point, the change manager, because they've been through the sort of method training that you describe, has been taught a tactic. And it's very much tactic led in a number of change methods. And I'm not rubbishing them all, because there's some really good tools and approaches in them, but to rely on them in totality, in my view, is is not the approach. But what you then do is I tell you what's in it for you, Rory, right? So having tried to explain the situation, I now tell you what's in it for you. Now, as those words come out of my mouth, I'm inside, I'm thinking, Mark, you arrogant what's it? How on earth would I know what's important to Rory, let alone knowing what's important for him and what's in it for him? Because what's in it for him might be really intrinsic, not extrinsic with the sort of things that I'm describing. And then if it doesn't land again, as a change manager, I'll fall the ace from my pack, which is I'll put a label on you, and the label will be Rory is change resistant. Because at that point, that suits my narrative. It's not about you, it's about me. And it leads me back to the point, and Waleed was smiling at this when we were chatting through on Monday. It's interesting that it's all called change management, right? So two things about that I take issue with. So it's management, not leadership. Firstly, so you don't hear of many change leaders. And at this point, I know some people in the community will say, no, I'm a change leader, but we talk about change management as a discipline. And secondly, we talk about it in the sense of change, not changing, where the world is dynamic. Yeah, and things are constantly evolving. So to take this episodic view, I think doesn't work. So we need another approach, which is deeply empathetic. And in order to do that, change managers also need to take care of themselves. I did some research on how change managers take care of themselves a few years ago. I'll stick a link to that in as well. And basically, they don't take care of themselves very well at all. And they can be thrust from one intense project to another. They don't receive any form of supervision in terms of being able to unload what's happened. There's a lot of reviews, but they're more at a technical level. So if you are a counselor, you're a psychologist, if you're a coach, then you receive supervision, and supervision is part of your development, your ability to unload. Because as a change manager, you're in the process. And they often, as a change manager, and I know this going through, you end one gig, you start another. There's no time for R&R, for relaxation or reflection. So at this point, change managers are often more frazzled than the people they're helping to change. So it's akin to, on the bus of change, the driver is a drunk and he's tired. Yeah, and he's completely whacked. Now that isn't to say it's all like that, but these are some of the issues I have with change. Now, some of these change models are more person-centric. So they look at the whole person, but a lot of it is an engineering approach. And then when people don't fit our model of it, then we're quick to attach a label, and that convenient label of they're change resistant and change is hard. I don't think change is hard. If we look around, we're filled with examples of how people have been able to change and adapt and deal with this. Gets off soapbox.
It's interesting because, you know, I want to come back to this point regarding change leadership and change management. Can you have in a large enterprise change leadership? My question to both of you is, does change leadership only work for small teams or for small, you know, startups, whilst for large corporates it can only be change management because it has to be operational, it has to be nearly, you know, like a machine or turning from one to the other to the next stage, or could you have change leadership in a large corporate, but then it is followed up by that change management aspect? Because change leadership for me, you know, it is really, you know, leadership providing inspiration on what is possible and why there needs to be a change, and people hooking onto that. And you're coming back to your point where, you know, your own personal brand equity, I would guess that's more of a change leadership kind of situation. What is your views on that?
I mean, from my perspective, the large corporates are constantly changing, aren't they? If you look at BP's targets to move to 50% renewables in 10 years or whatever, that's a massive change in their business model. Nestle are trying to have zero carbon packaging.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you know, very significant changes. Most insurers and reinsurers, they're looking at, you know, the reduction in intermediation and fusing with the capital markets. And so I think in our industry, it's very, very dynamic at the moment, a lot of change, and I think you have to have that change leadership. Mark, what for your view?
Yeah, I see it as an and I think change leadership comes at all levels, and it's not just in the auspice of the sponsor. And don't get me wrong, sponsors are really important, and they need to be visible, vocal, engaged, and engaging, not just the person that turns up at the beginning and turns up at the end, but permissioning and servicing and serving throughout the process. But also, change is really powerful when it comes from within and from the people that own the outcomes. So often as a change leader, you're trying to be oil and glue. That's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to help bind it together, but give people the freedom and support and confidence to do that. And even if you go back to last week's example of when we were talking about future of work and stuff, this idea of a permanently flexible future, and this idea of the way that we're working is changing, and the need to bring that agility and changing behavior in throughout, it suddenly becomes a foundational competence and capacity. And it is, again, I think it's also a capacity as well. So our capacity to absorb change may vary, and our competence in navigating change may vary, in part because of skills, experience, and tools and techniques, but sometimes because our capacity has diminished as well. But I think it's really important to have a culture and have a behavior and have support with inside an organization, irrespective of size, that really is about seeing changing as a core part of what we do every day. It's these micro adjustments so that we don't have to violently veer from one side to the other. And that only works when you empower people to make those changes.
Or else they will try and make it themselves. Because if we look at the US, you had two ground up kind of movements. You had the one for Obama, in the first round of the elections, that was kind of a swell from a ground up. But also on the other opposite side, you had the Tea Party, which was also kind of a ground up kind of movement, wanting some level of changes. But
can I give you one more example?
Please.
So I was chatting with somebody this morning that was very senior in the military, and we were talking about autonomy then, and on the surface, people might observe the military as being a very strong chain of command, and it kind of ripples from top to bottom. But a lot of it's misunderstood, because actually it's a highly flexible organization, and you can have small squads of 4-6 people. And again, on the surface, it looks like that they practice and practice and practice, and they're turning things into rote. But actually what they're doing is they're exercising their changing muscle on a regular basis. So they're going through exercises, they conduct AARs, after action reviews, and they're learning all the time about what they might do differently. Because when they're in the field, things are really dynamic and changing quickly. And they're used to this muscle of taking information, call on a bank of experience, but flex and adapt. Yeah. So again, if you look at how the military works, there's a great deal of autonomy within it, despite it being a huge, highly structured organization.
Yeah. I'm going to bring this episode to a close, because I am sure we can talk about this for hours. It's a very interesting and subject, and very pertinent, especially nowadays. For you guys, what is your experience in terms of change? Whether you were a change leader, whether you're a change manager, whether you experienced change, whether personal or within your profession. We'd love to hear your story. So feel free to add a comment below, and we'll be seeing you next week. So have a wonderful rest of the day or evening, and we'll be catching you very soon. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.